everyone, and welcome to NCDDC's online ISO metadata training series. Today we're going to continue with UML basics. Again, if you have more than one person logged in per registration link, if you have several people in a conference room and have not previously discussed like arrangements of keeping the same people on the list, if you could just go ahead and email us a list of participants at each location to ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov. Also, we'll try to have some time for Q&A at the end of questions and answers at the end of the session. If you could type those into the chat, the questions window, and we'll try to get to those as we can. Also, if you notice in the chat window, I have the links so that you can cut and paste into your browser for our materials. Again, all of our series materials are located on the FTP site at ftp.ncddc.noaa.gov/pub/metadata/online_ISO_training, and we're doing the Intro to ISO course. And again, anytime that you see this information link at the corner of any slide, that means that you can click on that and go to further information in the NOAA EDM wiki, and that kind of goes through a lot of more examples and use cases for a particular item that we're talking about on that slide. And again, the workbooks can be found in your series materials online at the FTP site and also at ncddc.noaa.gov/metadata-standards. All right, well, last week we had some homework, and so we'll go over that first. And you should be seeing up on the screen, I have here the answer key, and I have the XML copy of the sample file to use. You could have used the resolved or the unresolved copy. You could have used the HTML or XML, although I really wanted you to try to look at the XML and get familiar with that and use the HTML as a supplemental guide. The first question is, what is the title of the data set? I went ahead and opened this up. You could use the XML. You could look at that in the browser, or you could have opened it up in an XML editor if you chose to. I went ahead and opened it in an XML editor called XML Spy so that we could get actual line numbers here. And a good little rule when you're trying to look at XML, especially as you're getting used to it, it can be quite overwhelming at first. I like to go ahead and minimize these little lines so I can really see what I'm trying to look at here and really kind of get into, okay, just the basics of the XML here. So here we have, what is the title of the data set? Well, title is going to be found in identification information because that's where the basic information about this resource lies. So if I open up identification information, I can see citation and my title. And the identification information starts on line 75, and the title starts on line 79. And the title is the EX-1003 transit from Hawaii to Guam on NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer in Hawaii to Guam between these dates. That's a very nice title, and remember that kind of title when you go to write metadata, because you want what, when, where, and why. You want to have the basic information that's encompassing of the data that you're going to be documenting. So that's the answer for number one. Number two, what are the bounding coordinates? What geographic location does it describe? The bounding coordinates, which is its extent, again, that's the basic information about that data set. So that, too, would be found in identification information. The extent starts on line 439, and I can kind of go ahead and start closing some of these tags again so that I can see what I'm working with here. And I see In data identification, I have citation, abstract, purpose, credit, status, point of contact. I can really see the pieces of identification information. And I see here extent. And I can expand that open, and I get my bounding extents here. I have my west-bounding longitude, my east-bounding longitude, my south-bounding latitude, and my north-bounding latitude. So we now have the bounding coordinates. Now, what geographic location does it describe? Well, we can find that in the title, and we can also find that information in the keywords. So if we look in descriptive keywords, if we look on line 364 is where the descriptive keywords start, and we can look at different types of keywords. And we really want to look at place keywords, not just theme keywords. We want to look at place because we want to know what geographic location does it describe. And here's some descriptive keywords describing that: South Pacific Ocean and Hawaii to Guam. We can also look at the FTP, in the FTP, if we could look in our browser at the HTML view. If we go to identification information, it has a nice display of it, and we can go through and say, okay, let's look at these keywords. These are place keywords, and they're listed right here. All right, number 3, why was this data set created? Well, to find that out, that information is going to be in the citation information, and we'll see the purpose. So we see identification information, we see right under citation information, we see abstract, and then purpose. The purpose is for ocean exploration and research. All right, number 4, find one theme keyword. If we open up our descriptive keywords, we can look at the type and see what type of keywords they are, and we can see that the theme keywords, and this is one type. Again, if you're more comfortable at this point kind of going into the HTML and looking, keywords are going to be in identification information, and we can scroll down and look at the descriptive keywords and look at the theme. Here's the keyword type, theme. Okay, Earth, Science, Oceans is one, and then in another descriptive keywords, and it's a theme here, we have ocean exploration. All right, which metadata sections are used in this record? This one's kind of tricky, but if you remember back in the 101, I showed you how the structure contained the root, and the root had elements about the metadata itself, and then it contained the main sections as well. We can see that in the XML when we look here. We have the root here, MD metadata, file identifier, language, character set, hierarchy name, hierarchy level, level name, the contact, the date stamp, metadata standard name and version. These are all elements of the metadata itself. That's all describing the metadata itself. These are the main sections: identification information, content information, metadata maintenance. One nice thing about the HTML view is that that kind of shows that clearer, because at the very top of the HTML view, you have the title, and then it lists the main sections for you. Because here, this goes into that general information about the metadata itself, and then it jumps down to each of these main sections: identification information, content information, and metadata maintenance information. All right, number 6, who created the data set? This is going to be the originator. And in ISO, you have different roles that are given to the citations, the cited responsible party. So who is the originator? Again, if we got the contact info here, this is the originator of the metadata, okay, because it's part of the metadata information. We want the data set. So we look in the identification information. And in the citation, we have a title, date. And again, if you close these, that really helps kind of see what's going on. We have two different cited responsible parties. We have one listed as NOAA, OAR, OER, Ocean Exploration and Research, and here's all the information about that. And then and their role is originator. And then we have another one, Elizabeth Lobecker, with all of her information, and she's the science party. So the originator, I kind of think of who created it, who funded it, who paid for this, whose program is this under. That's going to be the originator. So the answer would be Ocean Exploration and Research. Now, what time period is covered by the data set? Well, again, this would be information that's in the extent. And we have the geographic element that we've already looked at. Well, we also have a temporal element piece of extent, and that is where our time periods would be. And here's the beginning dates and times, and here's the ending dates. All right, number 8, can anyone use this data? Well, in the identification information, though there's a piece that kind of goes over what are your use and access constraints, okay? And resource constraints, you see here on line 403, this goes through and it lists, okay, there's other restrictions, and our other constraints are access constraints, no access constraints. Use constraints, there are no use constraints. So can anyone use this data? Yes, there are no use constraints. This is the section where you would put your lawyer blurb, is what I call them. If you have a standardized way that you release responsibility or any of that type of information, this is where you put that information at. You can either select from one of the code lists and just use that, or if you have a free text blurb that you would like to insert in there, you'd select other restrictions and then use the free text other constraints to list your specific constraints that you would have. All right, number 9, what port did this cruise sail out of? Well, to find that information, the geographic element in the extent, again, we go back to extents, and we have some other geographic elements. One of them was the bounding box, and another one is the start port. And the start port here is listed as Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And again, you can find all of this in the HTML as well. You have here the extent, and here you have the different types of information here in the HTML as well. All right, number 10, if I want to find more cruises like this one, where should I look or who should I contact? You can always contact the POC of the data set, but a great place to look to see if I want more like this, are there more available? You can look in aggregation information. And this shows me that there's a larger work citation, that there is a larger work, that there's a program that has probably a lot of cruises like this one. And I have all of their contact information here. So that there provides me a place and mechanism to go contact if I want to find more just like this, because this is just part of the larger work that's cited here. All right, if anybody has any questions about that, or they would like a copy of the answer key, they can email ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov, and we will send you a copy of that answer key. So with that, today we're going to go into UML Basics, which is Unified Modeling Language. This is the standard available from the technical committee, TC 211. This is the ISO standard. The standard utilizes UML, which is Unified Model Language, diagrams and tables to describe the standard. So this is actually a screenshot of the front page of the standard, and this is what some of the UML inside of the standard looks like. This is what they use to describe the object-oriented relationships and how things are ordered in this standard. Again, these standards you have to purchase from ISO or ANSI or your government affiliation through ISO, or you can look in the workbooks, and the workbooks are freely distributable, and they're on the FTP as part of your resource materials. And they have in an annex in the back, they have a lot of the UML diagrams in there, and as well as the workbook contains a lot of the information used for implementing the standards. The Unified Model Language, UML, is used to represent the relationships among classes and objects in object-oriented programming. This schema XSD file is built from the UML diagrams. It's just a screenshot showing that. So everything that we use to implement these standards come from those UML diagrams and tables that are in the ISO standards. This is one of the most important slides that you will need to have for referencing as you start to learn the ISO, how they implement the UML. UML is, there's some programmers that will take a whole semester course on this information, but ISO only uses a small portion of UML to document their standards, and so we're going to focus on how ISO uses the UML. Relationships can be represented in the ISO UML models as associations, aggregations, and compositions. An association, you'll see here, has the arrow. Okay? It's general relationships between classes. If the direction is not specified, it is assumed to be a two-way association. Arrows marking an end of a line mark the direction of an association. The model will also show the role of the target object in relation to the source object. Next, we have aggregation, and it's noted by this empty diamond. Okay, and aggregation, one class is the container, and the other class is within and inside. So MD underscore metadata contains a section called MD underscore distribution. Next, we have a composition. These are also known as strong aggregations. This is used when parts inside the container cannot exist without the container. If the container is deleted, then all of the objects inside the container are deleted as well. So if this is deleted, anything that's in here would be deleted, whereas in the aggregation, these may stand alone. Next, we have a generalization. It's an empty triangle. This shows a superclass and subclasses that may be substituted for the superclass. Okay, an example, general overall constraints, MD underscore constraints, are documented through MD constraints, but the subclass, which is a type of constraints, MD security constraints, can substitute its superclass MD constraints. Security constraints has the same objects as MD constraints, but also has a few more objects to specifically deal with documenting constraints dealing with security. So whatever elements are listed to fill out under this section, well, you can take this section and replace it, and it will inherit all of these elements plus add some of its own. And then a dependency is also known as an instantiation. It's kind of like an if statement. Example, if access constraints or use constraints equals other restrictions, then other constraints must be used. So this kind of shows your dependencies on, okay, if I do this, then I need to also do this information. And we'll see some of those in the UML that we'll look at. All right, this shows the cardinality and some of the associations. Okay, this shows if a class is mandatory and how many times it can or must repeat. So this is the association cardinality. If it has 1, that means that I have exactly one of these. This means that it's optional because it's 0, but I can repeat it. I can have more. This shows it's optional, but I can only have 1. This means that it's mandatory. I must have 1, but I can repeat it, so I can have 1 or more. And this shows that I must have a specific number. All right, this is an example UML from the business world, okay, where we have a customer that has elements, the name and address of a customer, and they may or may not have an order. So you have to have at least a customer, but it's optional for the customer to order, and a customer may have more than one order. Now, an order will include a date and a status, and the tax, the total, and the weight, okay? If there's an order, there must be 1 or more payments, okay? Now, I can just say payment and amount, or I could take something like cash and replace payment. So if I fill out cash, cash is going to have amount and the cash tendered because this is a generalization. And again, generalizations can be substituted. Cash can substitute payment, but it's going to inherit any of the elements inside of payment. Now, order, okay, it has an aggregation. That means it's the container. It contains a compound called order detail, and the order detail may have quantity, tax status, all that information. And then we may or may not have more item information, such as shipping weight, the description, and all of that type of information. And again, the more you look at UML and the more you really see how the XML comes into play, just with experience, you'll get more comfortable with it. The ISO UML packages, these are components in logical classes. The 2-letter abbreviations denote the packages, and the class name follows an underscore. So we talked a little bit about this last week, about these packages, how you'll see these 2-letter codes and an underscore. And these are the types of packages that you'll see throughout these main sections, throughout the ISO metadata. You have here metadata entity set information, which is MD metadata. You also may have MI metadata if you're using the -2. You have identification information. That's inside of MD metadata, okay? That's MD identification. You have constraints, data quality, maintenance information, spatial representation, reference info, the content info, portrayal catalog, distribution, metadata extent information, application schema, okay, and then you have extents and citations inside of all of those. So if you remember back at the in the ISO 101, the different sections that we talked about, the main sections of it. Again, these are the main sections of ISO. You'd have MD or MI metadata. That has the elements about the metadata itself. And then it also contains these other main sections. MD metadata contains the information about all of that, and then it also contains these main sections here that we just went over: the spatial representation info, reference system, metadata extension, identification, content, distribution, data quality, portrayal catalog, metadata constraint information, application schema info, and metadata maintenance information. As you get familiar looking at these, you will see, especially when you're looking at the XML, you kind of saw how some of that information was organized. So that you know that when you go and look at, okay, I want to know how this information is distributed. I want to know how I can download this online. Well, I'm going to go look in the distribution information section. If I want to know what steps were used in processing this data, I'm going to look in data quality information. But if I want to know the general information, such as, all right, well, what's the title of this data set? What are the bounding coordinates? What's the purpose? Who do I contact? What time periods does this cover? That's all going to be the basic information about that resource, which is found in identification information. All right, so here's the UML for ISO 19115. Okay, this defines the class MD_metadata and shows the containment relationships with the other metadata classes. Okay, we have here MD metadata, and it's helpful if we remember each of these items is an XML tag. So that will kind of help you walk through some of this information. Now we see MD metadata, MD_metadata has the information, these elements about that metadata itself. The file identifier, the languages, the character sets. It tells me, okay, hierarchy level. This is optional, but it's repeatable, so I can have more than one. So I have all this information. Now, MD_metadata contains, again, this is aggregation. One class is the container, and the other class is within and inside of it. So inside of MD metadata, I could have spatial representation info, which is MD spatial representation. MD metadata can also contain, at this level, reference system information, which is MD reference system. I can have metadata extension information. I can have identification information. I can have any of these because inside of MD metadata. Now remember, we also have, this is one of those dependencies, one of those if statements. Okay, this shows me some of the, if I'm using MD metadata, some of the things I need to think about to be in adherence with the standard. Okay, language, I see language is optional in 1. Okay, this is to be documented if it's not defined by the encoding standard. So even though it's optional, if the encoding standard doesn't define it, then put it. So usually as a best practice, we go ahead and put language in there. Character set is also optional, but it's documented if the ISO 10646-1 is not used and defined by the coding standard. It's actually by default UTF-8, but if it's not understood to be that, then it's mandatory. Hierarchy level, we see that it's optional and repeatable, but by default, it's data set. So if it's not data set, then this becomes mandatory because it's one of those dependencies. And then hierarchy level name we see as optional, but if hierarchy level does not equal data set, then this becomes mandatory. So that's how you read some of those dependencies in there. Now remember, we've talked a lot about metadata contains the elements about metadata itself as well as these other sections. So how does that look like in the XML? We have MD_metadata. These are those pieces that we saw right here. These information right here, we find that in this link in here. And then these are some of the main packages, or these main sections. And they are at the same level because they are inside of this container. So we see MD metadata contains reference system info, metadata extension, metadata maintenance, ID info. If we look over here, MD metadata contains these main sections. Now with the -2, the ISO 19115-2 extends the 19115 specifically for imagery, gridded data, and instrumentation. The root of 19115 metadata records will change from MD metadata, MD_metadata, to MI_metadata when using the -2. And then all of this remains the same, but this is also added. Okay, a new section is added, the acquisition information, and it includes a new package called MI_acquisition information. So the UML for that is this. We have MD metadata, okay, and we may substitute MD metadata because this is a generalization with MI metadata. So when we substitute it, that means we're going to take all the information from here and put it inside of here, and then we're also going to add acquisition information. All right, this next section shows the spatial representation information in more detail. Here I have spatial representation info, and that is our general class. Now we have the choice here of grid spatial representation or vector spatial representation. Now within grid spatial representation, I have the choice of georectified or georeferenceable. And remember, this is a generalization, means, okay, that it's a superclass and these are its subclasses. Okay, this is superclass and these are the subclasses. So if I use MD georectified, okay, I inherit all of this information as well as these individual items for the georectified as well. So MD georectified will have a number of dimensions: access dimension properties, cell geometry, transformation parameter availability, as well as checkpoint availability, checkpoint description, corner point, center point, point and pixel, etc. These are some of the code lists that are going to be referred to in here. Say you have an MD geometric objects. Here's the object type code, so here's the code list that you would use. These code lists are also available in your workbooks and online as well. All right, next we're going to look at the reference system. This defines metadata required to describe the spatial and temporal reference system used. A lot of times, I like using components here, and if you remember components, that's that reusable snippet of XML that you can use over and over again, because if you define that once, you can just point to it. And a lot of registries out there already have all of that information defined if you just cite that reference and cite, yes, I'm using WGS84. But you go ahead and say reference system, and then reference system will contain the reference system identifier, the projection, the ellipsoid, and the datum. And it has its projection parameters that have all of these other parameters as well, all for defining your spatial and temporal reference systems. Next, we have metadata extension information. This is where you define how you extend the standard if you extend it. A great use case of how this is actually used is if you extend the standard for biological information, using a biological profile, if you will, and you want to add in taxonomic information to your metadata. This defines, you can go through here and say, I'm using the biological extensions and how I use those. Or if you have any organizational specific stuff that you need to extend the metadata for, or a specific profile, if you need to extend the ISO metadata standards and that information cannot be put anywhere else into that standard, there's no place for it to belong, then you can extend the ISO metadata standards. And this is where you document how you extend it so other people can understand what those tags are. All right, next we have identification information. Again, this is kind of the meat of a lot of your metadata. This defines the metadata class required to identify a resource. It also defines separate specialization subclasses for identifying data and services. So if I notice here, I have MD identification. Okay, we saw if there were MD metadata or MI metadata had identification information. Okay, so inside of MD metadata, you have MD identification information, and I'll have citation, abstract, purpose, credit, status, point of contact. We saw all of that in that XML document, the exercise that we did last week. Well, with identification, I have two types of identification. I can either have a data identification or I could have service identification. For data identification, since this is a generalization, what I do is I inherit all of these properties. So I'd have the XML tag, MD metadata. The next one would be identification information. And then I would have MD data identification. And then I would have the elements citation, abstract, purpose, credit, status, point of contact, and then also spatial representation type, spatial resolution, language, character set, topic category, environment description, extent, and supplemental info, all under the MD data identification tag. My data identification, I can also contain keywords, my constraints, aggregation information, usage, browse graphics, format. And you see here I have some dependencies as well noted. Okay, for data identification, again, character set, you see here it's optional. Well, it becomes mandatory if I don't use that default. And this kind of goes into some of the more information about some of the different dependencies that you may encounter. But again, if you have we'll cover ISO tools on the February 12th, the tools for ISO metadata. A lot of the tools that you'll use will take a lot of this information and kind of give you those parameters for you so that you don't have to go into the UML in such detail. But if worst case scenario, you ever get asked a question and you don't have a tool to help you, you can go to the UML and find all this exact about the standard so that there are no questions. You can go in and read the standards for yourself. And once you get to reading the standards, you also may notice that there may be a bug in a tool that you're using if it's not actually agreeing with the standards. So that's something that you might want to know about. And again, the identification information, especially the data identification, it contains that basic information about your metadata. It has browse graphics. If you want to say, okay, well, here's a file name and a description and a file type, so I can have a picture attached to my metadata. If I want to list all my keywords that describe, the different types of keywords, see, keyword is optional here, but it's repeatable. Okay, if I choose keywords, if I have descriptive keywords, I have to at least have one keyword or more. So it's repeatable. My type, this is where you say if it's a place keyword or a theme keyword or a temporal keyword. And you actually have a code list here that these must follow. It's the MD keyword type code. This is where you pick discipline, place, stratum, temporal, or theme. So whatever keywords you pick of which one of these types. And then your thesaurus name, this is where you cite the thesaurus that you're picking these keywords from, or you can just have a user-defined one and put as the citation none. All right. Next we have the content info. This defines metadata about the content of a coverage and the feature catalogs used to define the features. So this is the place that if you have a feature catalog, again, that's the 19110, and that's a separate document. That's where you can actually say, do I have a feature catalog, yes or no? Okay, is it included with we have a Boolean, yes or no? And then we can cite it. We can cite and link out to that feature catalog. Or we can go ahead and add a lot of the coverages in here and talk about the attribute descriptions. If it was remotely sensed data, or picked up with any electromagnetic wavelengths or anything, this is where we can go in and describe all of those band values and the ranges. And we can also talk about the image description, if there's cloud cover, processing levels, and all of that type of information. So this goes through and really talks about my attributes and my coverages that are in my data in more detail. Again, I can cite a lot of the coverages here, or I could link out to the feature catalog that I can use over and over again. All right, next we have the distribution information. This is the UML for the distribution information. This defines the metadata required for being able to access your resource. So MD metadata contains distribution information, which is MD distribution information, and we have a distribution format, a distributor, and a transfer options. So this is where we go through and say, okay, what format is this in? What's the name? Is it a .NET-CDF file, or is it a spreadsheet? What version of that format is being used? Is there any specifications or file decompression techniques that we need to use for this? Is it a .gz or .tar? That's important information to have. All right, who's the distributor? Who's the responsible party? Who do I contact? Who's being able to allow the access of this? And then the transfer options. What, how big of a file size is this that I'm going to be using? Is this transferred? Is there an online option or an offline option, or is it only available offline? Do I have to request a CD-ROM of it, or will somebody, is there an HTTP or URL or somewhere that I can go and get this data from? So this is how you document the distribution information. And you notice sometimes these standards seem circular, and that's because they are. So you have to be very careful not to get kind of caught up in saying, okay, well, what's going on? You have to look at the pieces that you're looking at contextually within their tags. Okay, if I'm under distribution information and I'm looking at distributor, this is the person who's distributing that data. Okay, this is who I'm getting that from. But MD format also has a distribution format distributor. That may be who is the responsible party for making that format. So you need to be aware of where you're looking at and where you're looking at contextually, and also what makes the most sense when you start writing your metadata and having templates. And you don't want to get in a constant circle, which you could in this particular. This is one of the trickier ones where you can have the same type of information and it looks like you're displaying it in the same manner, but in reality, based on the tags and where they're located contextually, you change the meaning of the information that really goes there. All right, next we have data quality. Okay, this again goes through the lineage, and it's all the steps. Okay, this would break out into lineage, and that goes through all your processing steps. But you can also document here the data quality, the name of the measure that you performed. These are your quality checks and controls that you, or processing that you do. Measure description, the methods, what's the procedure? Is there a citation to that procedure, the date and time that you did this, and then the results? And you have all types of different quality controls that you can have. You can have lots of different reports, the data quality reports. And when you get the standard, it goes into a lot more detail about those different reports. And you just select one. You can do a specific report on the omissions that are in your data, the holes or gaps. Or you can do specific reports on quantitative results versus qualitative results. There's various different reports that you can do. but they all contain the same information, the name of the measure and their descriptions and their methods, and then when you processed it, and also by who. The Portrayal Catalog defines the metadata about the portrayal catalogs used to display the data. And again, this one's pretty simple. MD metadata, the Portrayal Catalog, and then you have the CI citation. And that just links out to a citation exactly what that is. Okay, just the reference for that. And again, the Portrayal Catalog is the collection of defined symbols used to depict to humans features on a map. All right, you also may notice MD constraints. That's found in multiple locations in ISO metadata. It's found from MD metadata, and it's found from the identification. And again, this is a compound that is different information goes in it depending on where it's located contextually. The constraints, which is the use limitations, if they're in metadata constraints, these are the constraints on the metadata itself. Whereas the information in these tags, if they're under identification or data identification, they're going to be the constraints on the data itself or on that resource that you're using or that service. And again, if you look at constraints, you have a generalization. You can have just constraints, which is just the use limitation, or you can have legal constraints or security constraints. If I need to document both legal constraints and security constraints, if you notice, this is not repeatable, but this is. This is the XML tag that I would have to repeat. I would have to repeat either resource constraints or this metadata constraints if I want to document these both, because this is not repeatable. This part is. You have to move back up in the XML and repeat at the correct level. And again, if I do legal constraints, I'm going to have a use limitation, and I'm also going to have access constraints, use constraints, and other constraints. Here's that dependency here. Okay, if I use access constraints and put other restrictions from this code list here, and I have use constraints and I have other restrictions, okay, if these are both other restrictions, then I have to actually use this optional field, then that becomes mandatory and tells me, all right, go put in free text, type in what exactly those other restrictions are. And if I want to also document my security constraints, I'd come up here, and depending on where I'm at, if I want to document the metadata security constraints or the data security constraints, I'd repeat whichever tag I need to. And then for security constraints, I would have the use limitation, the classification, which comes from this classification code here, the user note, which is optional, and it's free text, my classification system, which is optional, and I can only have one of these in free text, and handling description, which is optional, but I can only have one of these, and then I have free text. And then this goes through metadata. MD metadata contains the application schema information. This is optional and repeatable. And this is the citation, the schema language and constraints used, the schema ASCII, the graphics binary file, software development files and formats, etc. Now the metadata maintenance, again, maintenance information is found either from the identification or the metadata. And it's different information here depending on where you're at contextually. The maintenance information could be, okay, the maintenance about the metadata itself, how often is this metadata reviewed and updated, or it can be the metadata or the maintenance information about the either data identification, which is the maintenance information about the data itself, or if you pick services identification, then it's going to be the maintenance information about that service. And then maintenance information here has maintenance and update frequency, date of next update, user-defined frequency, update scope description, maintenance note, and then it also contains a responsible party with the individual name, organization name, position name, contact information, and the role. And you see here again these code lists. So let's say I want to document who's maintaining my metadata. I would have MD metadata. I would have metadata maintenance. I would have MD maintenance information. Okay, I would pick maintenance and update frequency, and I would pick from this code list right here. Date of next update is optional, but if I did that, I'd go ahead and put in a date. The user-defined maintenance frequency is optional. Update scope is optional and repeatable. I may have more than one scope, but I have to pick from this code list over here. So I may update my attributes or features or my data sets or anything at different times. Okay, my update scope description, what about it am I updating? And then my maintenance note, these are my information. This is optional and repeatable, and this is free text. This is where I can come in and just type in any information, a little note that I want, that I find important to keep in the metadata. All right, this is the acquisition information. Again, this is only in the -2, the 19115-2. And again, if a metadata record starts with MD underscore metadata, it's a 19115. If it's MI underscore metadata, it's a -2. So MI metadata, you have all that information that's inside of MD metadata, plus you add acquisition information. And this is optional. So again, I can have everything that's in MD metadata, and then I have the option of if I want to add this or not. This is why a lot of organizations choose to use the 19115-2 as the standard that they like to use, because it has all the same stuff as the -1 or the 19115, the MD metadata, and then everything else that it adds is optional to even add it. But it's easier to add more later without changing the roots, rather than trying to change the roots and then add more. It's a lot easier to shave stuff off that you don't need rather than try to come back and add more to something later. Now, acquisition information contains an acquisition plan, operations, acquisition requirements, environmental conditions, objectives, instruments, and also platforms. So inside of acquisition information, I can say I have, maybe the ship, and I have all the citation information about that ship, who owns that ship, launch dates, who to contact, and then I also have instruments. Okay, and these are the instruments that I collect data with. You may even have instruments on a ship. Or I just may have an instrument that I go out in the field with and collect information with, and I have the citation of who's the responsible party, who's the contact for that instrument, the identifier. This is where you can do codes and everything. The type of, there's a free text there for the type of instrument, and then a description. I find it useful also to always link to the instrument manufacturer's spec file for that instrument. I find that pretty useful, because then you're going back to the manufacturer, and it has a lot of times the thresholds of that instrumentation. All right, you'll notice that the ISO standards are made up of a collection of objects, a lot of these little boxes that are held together to make the larger structures. Okay, you see a lot of the little boxes all kind of fit into each other. They're much like atoms are held together to form molecules. We'll start with simple atoms, and then understanding of the fundamentals is gained. We build them step by step into these big molecules, if you will. So you'll notice, you'll see a lot of citation used over and over again. people, online resources, identifiers, extents. All of these build together to make ISO metadata. Here's all of these things that you'll notice over and over again. Inside of them, in my platform, you'll have a citation that links back out to another box, CI citation. Okay, and then it has an MD identifier. So it has these two boxes, plus then you just add description and sponsor. Identification has a citation, which again is a CI citation. And then it has abstract purpose, credit, status, point of contact, again, which is CI responsible party, so it links back out again. So a lot of these pieces are used over and over again. So if you know how to build a citation, you know how to start building on those to build other objects here. This is the CI citation, and you notice in all citations, again, from here, citation, just imagine this opening up, CI citation, then I need all of this information from CI citation to go in right here. And then I go to identifier and description and sponsor. But CI citation is made up of a title, which is a free text character string. I have an alternate title, which is optional and repeatable. I have a date, which has to be of a CI date. That's a specific date time format, and that's mandatory and repeatable. Addition date, identifier, a cited responsible party. Again, we have another thing another one of those little building blocks that we link back out to, which is our responsible party. Presentation form code series, other citation details, collective title, ISBNs, and ISSNs. Now, if we go through and look at, okay, well now responsible party, what pieces build this piece up? I have responsible party with individual name, organization name, position name, role, and then I have their contact info, which I may have an online resource with all of their the link and the protocols, their phone numbers, voice or fax number, and then their address, which is a delivery point, city, administrative service, you know, the state that they're located in or the country, and their email address. Now, all of these elements to fill out are part of responsible party, which actually plug in here, which just helps fill out citation that plugs in again to any of these other little building blocks. So you see how these build up on each other. So again, don't get lost when going through the kind of down the rabbit hole when looking at some of this stuff. Now you have another exercise this week, and this is actually trying to put into practice a lot of what we talked about today, because the only way to really get used to understanding and grasping what we're doing here is actually to try to look at it and use it and practice it. So what I would like for you guys to do is on this FTP here, there in the exercises, there's an exercise called Getting Familiar with the ISO 19115 exercise document. And that's going to ask you questions about the standard. And you're going to use these workbooks here, these PDFs, to kind of navigate through and answer some of these questions. And what that helps you do is, one, helps you learn the standard and how to read it, and also helps you how to use the workbooks for implementing the standards. And again, if you have any questions, you can email ncddcmetadata@noaa.gov, or some of the stay on a little bit longer, and we'll try to answer some of these questions and email those out like we did last week. A lot of the questions that we got typed in the window, we didn't have time to go over during the telecon, but we will compile that list and email that back out. Now, I will also put in the chat window, I will put in what these links are so that you can copy and paste to the exercises. Okay, so if you look in your chat window, you will see the links that you can copy and paste from. And with that today, we filled up all of the time, but what we're going to do is any questions that we get emailed into NCDDC metadata, and any of these questions that were in that we didn't get to in the chat, we're going to compile that list again and send that back out to everybody again, like we did last week. All right, everybody, thank you. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us. Have a good day.